This is our presentation about the Cold War, and I'm Kobe Valley.
And I'm Inas Jawad.
The Cold War was a war between the Soviet Union and the United States. Each side was fighting for their political ideology and socio-economic system to be the dominant one in the world, the one in which most of the world's governments followed and used. Capitalism versus communism. The US and USSR both had the goal of giving a good life to their citizens, but they each had a different way of achieving it. They had differences in beliefs of how to provide a good life for their country's citizens, especially for their workers. The US thought capitalism was the best way, while the USSR thought it was communism. What is communism? Communism was created by Karl Marx and is a system where people get paid based off their needs and their skills. Property is also owned by the public and not just by one person. What is capitalism? Capitalism is a system where production is privately owned and focuses on profit. People have to work for their money so they could buy basic necessities. Also, unlike capitalism, property is privately owned. Differences in beliefs. These differences in beliefs about which system was better caused tensions to rise. Both sides had a lack of trust for each other and were afraid of attacks from one another. This lack of trust and the rising tension led to things like both sides building up a significant amount of weapons in case of an attack. And as you can tell by the graph on the right, the amount of warheads that the USSR and the United States both had at the start of the war went up significantly by the end of it.
Okay, so we're going to talk about Richard Nixon and Nikita Khrushchev's kitchen debate. This is really important because it was kind of like the first face-to-face argument between an American and a Russian about their political ideas. So in 1959, Vice President Richard Nixon and Soviet leader Nikita Khrushchev got into a heated debate about their country's socioeconomic ideologies during the opening ceremony of America's National Exhibition in Moscow, Russia. Nixon argued that capitalism is better, while Khrushchev argued that communism is better. This was a very important historical debate because it demonstrates, as I said before, what both nations thought about each other and how they argued why each of their political ideas was the right one, essentially. Yeah. So okay. So that it was somewhat of a long conversation. There's a big block of text. I'm just kind of summarize it. So yeah, Nixon was showing Khrushchev around an exhibit about an average American kitchen, and he was showing him this is a dishwasher, this is that, and he his tone that he had was that these things didn't exist in Russia. So he kind of expected Khrushchev to be surprised by seeing these things, but Khrushchev was what, kind of offended that he was no, these things really do exist in Russia, and communism doesn't mean that necessarily because that they're not advanced or technologically advanced and stuff. Also, Nixon makes the point how a steel worker can buy a $14,000 home, making $3 an hour, which kind of demonstrates that capitalism benefits everybody, not just the rich. But Khrushchev replied to him and said that both the peasant and the steel worker in Russia can afford housing, because housing is a right. Everybody gets, there's not an income inequality gap between the two. And also, yeah. So another point that Khrushchev made about homes was how homes in Russia are built to to sustain for generations, as opposed to in America, homes are built to last for 20 years or something. So capitalists can make more money when when buyers need to buy new homes, so they make more money and stuff. So yeah, there's a lot of points that were made. Another one was a criticism of Khrushchev to Nixon, how in America women didn't really have a big role in society, as shown by his points that he made about the kitchen, how women were only housewives during that time. They didn't really work in companies or work in the government. So that was that was another point that was made. So this kind of shows what the United States versus the Soviet Union in that conversation. So obviously, the United States, its economic and political system is capitalism and democracy. And one criticism that the United States had about Russia, that they lacked competition. Therefore didn't have as as much advancement in technology, didn't have like as better quality of things, I guess, in Russia because of the lack of competition. And it's that theory that employers and employees won't work as hard if there's no competition, if there's nothing to be gained out of it. And Nixon believed in equal opportunity for everybody, so they can kind of make a better life for themselves and have to rely on the government to do so. And then the Soviet Union, their political and economic system was obviously communism, and the Soviet Union criticized the United States and said that capitalism created income inequality, among people of different races, and even, gender inequality. Men and women don't make as much money, and and in Russia, like women can, women had jobs in Russia and weren't really just housewives. They were more than that. They were seen as more than that in their culture. And Khrushchev also believed that equality for everyone is a right. Everybody should be equal in everything, no matter what. The government should provide that for people and should put in the effort to make sure people are equal and not just rely on the rich for their generosity, essentially. A brief history as to what led to the Cold War. So in World War II, the Soviet Union and the United States were allies in fighting the Axis powers and shared the goal of wanting to end Hitler's Nazi regime from spreading anymore throughout the world. But that doesn't really necessarily mean that the United States and Russia were like best friends. I mean, they had the common goal of wanting to kind of stop Hitler, but they weren't like best friends. Yeah. So yeah, these kind of like are the beliefs that both countries had about each other during and after the war. One big one was that the United States took a long time before it decided to join World War II, which by that time, I mean, if they were allies, Russia really needed help because a lot of Soviet soldiers were lost throughout the war. So had the United States joined sooner, some lives would have been saved. And also, the Soviet Union resented the United States because of their refusal to acknowledge and treat the Soviet Union as a legitimate government that is a part of the international community. That was like another big one. And also the United States was also a bit resentful towards the actions and rules of Joseph Stalin. I mean, you could see that, communism, the way Stalin was, running his government wasn't, I guess, something Americans agree with. So yeah. So what kind of triggered the beginning of the Cold War was, so after World War II ended, Russia began expanding into Eastern Europe, which the United States saw as being an attempt to control the world and spread communism, kind of because of, how Hitler began spreading into other nations. That's kind of, America thought that was like Russia's attempt to do that. So they started building like, weapons and making strong relations with other nations to kind of, I guess the theory of like, well, not a theory, but it was like the approach of like containment. They wanted to do everything they can to stop Russia from spreading anymore, which then Russia thought, by America building weapons and making relations with other nations, that they were trying to control the world. So that's essentially, where the term arms race came from. And that's kind of how the Cold War began. There's an interesting fact I thought I should include in this, that the term Cold War was a term that first appeared in one of George Orwell's essays called You and the Atomic Bomb. And in the essay, Orwell expresses concern over living in a world that has weapons strong and capable enough to cause immense destruction. And that was pretty cool. I mean, George Orwell was a pretty popular author at the time, and he was, he expressed his opinions about politics and what things were going on in the world, so that was pretty cool. So the Soviet Union and the United States did not directly engage in armed fighting or conflict, but they were competing to be like the best and most powerful nation, with the best weapons and, the best technology and all. And one big part of the Cold War was like the propaganda posters, as, shown, that America had propaganda posters, about Russia, and Russia did the same about the United States, and they both were trying to like spread their ideologies, proving that, capitalism was better or like communism was better. That was like a big part of it, yeah.
Did the Cold War affect other nations? The Cold War affected other nations because they were trying to spread their ideologies to other countries, and these countries had to choose between the two ideologies and pick a side, which would then mean that they are allies of one nation and oppose another. Many conflicts resulted from the Cold War, but the most significant ones were the Korean War and the Vietnam War. The Cold War officially began in 1947 as a result of what we've discussed in earlier slides, and the war ended in 1991 when the Soviet Union dissolved into smaller republics, as a result of their economy crashing because of the depths and huge costs of the arms race. When the Berlin Wall was taken down, free elections were taking place throughout Eastern Europe, which led to the communist regimes to be voted out and for republics to replace them.